Hey everyone, welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. With me now is my guest, Dr. Terry Wahls, who is an Institute for Functional Medicine certified practitioner and a clinical professor of medicine at the University of Iowa, where she conducts clinical trials. In 2018, she was awarded the Institute for Functional Medicine's Linus Pauling Award for her contributions in research, clinical care, and patient advocacy. She is also a patient with secondary progressive multiple sclerosis, which confined her to a tilt recline wheelchair for 4 years. She restored her health using a diet and lifestyle program that she designed specifically for her brain, and now pedals her bike to work each day. She's the author of the Wahls Protocol, a radical new way to treat all chronic autoimmune conditions using Paleo principles, and the cookbook, the Wahls Protocol, Cooking for Life. You can learn more about her multiple sclerosis clinical trials at wahls.lab.ui, or I should say uiowa.edu. And there is also a one-page handout for the Wahls Diet that you can get at terrywahls.com/diet. So welcome, Dr. Wahls. It's a pleasure to finally connect with you. I've been meaning to do this with you for a very long time, so it's a pleasure.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So first, can you just briefly tell your personal story, obviously that I was alluding to about being confined to a wheelchair for a few years. What was the nature of how things, how MS came on for you and how did it affect your life?
The symptoms began during medical school, little jolts, electrical pain across my temple, usually on the right side, occasionally on the left. They had become more frequent, more severe. 20 years ago, out walking with my wife, Jackie, I developed weakness in my left leg. Saw the neurologist who said, this could be bad, or really, really bad. And 3 weeks later, I hear multiple sclerosis. I treat my disease very aggressively, seeing the best people I could find in the country. And 3 years later, I hear tilt recline wheelchair. I take Novantrin infusions, then Tizabri infusions, nothing helps. I am too weak to sit up at my desk. My face pains are relentlessly worse. Now, fortunately, I'm a physician, so I'm reading the basic science, I'm experimenting. I have this theory that mitochondria are the big driver, so I start using supplements to support my mitochondria. I've been following the Paleo diet, basically the Autoimmune Intervention Protocol, the AIP diet, for 5 years. I'm still getting steadily worse. By 2007, I'm so weak I cannot sit up. My face pains are certainly more severe, more difficult to turn off. I'm beginning to have brain fog. My chief of staff assigns me to the traumatic brain injury clinic that I'll have to start in about 6 months. And so I realized that I'm going to have to take medical retirement because that's a job I really can't do. But fortunately for me, that summer, I discovered the Institute for Functional Medicine. I take their course on neuroprotection. I discover electrical stimulation of muscles. I get my physical therapist to add that. And then I have a really big aha moment. And that is, what if I redesign my paleo diet based on all the science that I've been reading in functional medicine? So I have this new way of a highly structured paleo diet starting in December. I add back meditation. I've been doing the e-stim and the exercise into my, things happen very quickly. My pain is gone, my fatigue is gone. My physical therapist says, Terry, you're getting stronger. And he advances my exercises. 6 months into this, I'm walking without a cane. 9 months into this, I bike around the block for the first time in 6 years. So my kids are crying, my wife's crying, I'm crying. And of course, that really changes how I think about disease and health. My chief of medicine calls me in and asks me to get a case report written. And then he asks me to redirect my research program into investigating this protocol that I've created. And that's changed everything.
Well, I'm so happy for you that you found an answer. I'm very curious to hear, as an MD yourself, as a professor of medicine, I'm very curious to hear your perception of what conventional medicine's attitude is now or was at the time you were going through that about MS and the causes of it and the cure for it.
That's a pretty funny story. So, at the time I was diagnosed, no one knew what the cause of MS was. And we just talked about drugs. No one talked about diet or lifestyle or anything that was under your control. When I recovered, in 2008, people here at the university were just thrilled with my recovery. And I was actually on the research committee that oversees research called the IRB. They're thrilled. And then actually I start giving talks at the little organic grocer about my experience, and the MS Society wants me to come speak to them. I say, sure. And so I get interviewed by the clinical advisory committee, who decides to ban me as a speaker because they're afraid patients will stop their drugs, refuse drugs on the basis of my story.
They banned you as a speaker.
Yeah, they banned me as a speaker. And mind you, the university, and I should also tell you, I got called into the chief of staff and called into the neurology office, pardon me, the chief of medicine office at the university, because I had to explain, because my colleagues, my physician colleagues, were complaining that I wasn't following the standard of care. And both the chair of medicine and the chief of staff at the VA hospital had heard that I was a banned speaker. Now, I had brought with me an armful of scientific papers explaining my rationale for the various supplements that I used and why I was so focused on diet and lifestyle. Unfortunately, I won over my chief of staff and my chair of medicine. But they said, Terry, you got to learn how to talk about this in a way that's not getting your practitioners, your fellow physicians upset. So I got sent to the complementary alternative medicine clinic, met with their chief, the director, and I learned some very important lessons, which I think were valid, that I was careful to document in my medical record that I'm teaching people how to improve diet and self-care routine, that I'm not treating their chronic disease, that this is an alternative to FDA-approved treatments, in that we would continue their approved treatments. I would implement this additional adjunct therapy, and then I would monitor and adjust medications as needed. And I put in big disclaimers on all of my talks that, keep working with your personal physician. This is not FDA approved to treat, prevent, cure any disease. That I'm focused on improving how your cells function, and that you need to work with your personal physician, because if your cells do improve, the doses of medications that you may need if you're on any prescription meds may change. Mm-hmm. So once I learned how to talk about it in a way that was more comfortable for my colleagues, and I made clear that, yep, I'm not going to adjust their drugs. It's up to them to adjust their drugs. I'm going to talk to people about improving their diet and self-care routine. And my chief of staff and the chief of medicine said, Wahls is just saying stuff that we should all be saying. Mm-hmm. And if ever patients get into trouble, we'll put it through peer review, just like we would anyone else. Mm-hmm. And of course, my patients did get into trouble for eating more vegetables. And over time, because we started doing research, and consistently the message in my research is people could make these big changes in their diet and self-care routine, and that their fatigue would go down, their energy would improve, their quality of life would improve, and clinical measures of walking and motor function would improve. We've done 4 clinical trials, consistent results every time. We've got 2 more trials that we're getting ready to launch, and we keep writing grants, so we'll have more and more studies.
And I would love to talk to you about the details of those studies, but before we get there, I want to just comment on what you just described of kind of your own personal story of navigating, getting this information out, but people getting mad at you and trying to censor you and prevent you from speaking. Do you have any words or thoughts on sort of the broader cultural context of that? Meaning, why do you think that was happening, in the sense of, does it have anything to do with financial motives and you getting in the way of financial agendas? Does it have anything to do with the fact that most MDs don't really receive any education or almost no education in nutrition and lifestyle? What do you think are the biggest factors that played into that reaction they had towards you?
For the longest time, for hundreds of years, physicians were taught diet, because that was all that we had. Around the turn of the century, we also had homeopathy and some osteopathy, but that got drummed out of medical school with the Flexner report. And at that time, Carnegie was developing the first line of pharmaceuticals. He was very interested in more of the scientific method and having providers that could use his pharmaceuticals. And over time, as the medical curriculum continues to grow and expand, nutrition got squeezed. It's very hard to find any hours for nutrition. So, and when I got my MD, I don't recall any nutrition hours, although it's possible that there were some.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of medical schools have very limited hours of nutrition. We may have entire courses related to pharmaceuticals. We'll have courses related to physiology, pathophysiology, et cetera. But the osteopathic schools have more nutrition education than the MD schools. So that's a big problem. And physicians, we have less and less time with our patients, so it becomes easier to quickly diagnose, quickly write a prescription, and send people on their way.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they knew something about nutrition, it is hard to get behavior change to happen. That's a complex process.
Mm-hmm.
And so it felt, when I was staffing residents in primary care, I'm talking to the residents about biochemistry, and they think I'm talking about the latest newest drug, and I'm talking about turmeric or broccoli. And so it's a bit of a whiplash. But I was very much into talking biochemistry in relating it to the food and to our exercise and stress reducing practices.
Mm.
And then I would go in and have a few minutes with the vets. And my residents were amazed at how quickly I could get vets fired up about eating vegetables in just 2 or 3 minutes, 5 minutes at most. And so they would over time get to be very excited, like, I can't wait to see how you're going to convince this sort of cantankerous farmer to start eating vegetables. Mm-hmm. And so it ended up being lots of fun. Now, the other faculty that was staffing resident clinic with me was a very traditional pharmacy first kind of person. And so there were 2 very different styles of practicing medicine that were going on there.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. For me, it feels hard to overstate the insanity of a situation where we're educating doctors with almost no education in nutrition or lifestyle, and yet we know over 80% of the disease burden in this country is from nutrition and lifestyle.
Well, when I went to medical school, we were so excited about the genetics that we were beginning to learn, the Human Genome Project, and we had this mistaken belief that once we sequenced the genome, we'd understand chronic disease, and we'd be able to treat and cure and prevent chronic disease.
Yeah.
As we've gotten better at understanding big data, we are getting better at understanding the mechanisms by which diet matters, the microbiome matters, sleep matters, and exercise matters. And we're beginning to get more of the basic science behind why diet, lifestyle, and self-care is so important. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, until we understand the basic science behind it, people have not been very enthusiastic about it.
Yeah. So talk to me about some of the mechanisms of what is known about what actually causes MS specifically, or you could talk about autoimmunity more broadly, however you want to break that down. And what are some of those environmental and lifestyle factors that are known contributors to the development of MS?
So I'm going to give you a little historical context. So I'm diagnosed in 2000. I do what many physicians do when you get diagnosed with a bad disease. You go to PubMed and you start reading all that you can. At that time, we know that there's a genetic predisposition. There's probably an infection that occurs before the age of 15. And then these unknown environmental factors that lead some people to get MS and others not. And that was all that was really known. No one really identified the environmental factors other than say the environmental factors. And so take these drugs, which could decrease the risk of relapse by about a third. And so I started on those drugs. And actually my family convinced me to stop reading because all I was doing was getting really upset, like, oh my God, this looks, so incredibly grim. So I didn't read for 3 years until I got into the wheelchair. Then I'm like, okay, well, I know how bad it is. I might as well go back to reading. So at that time, there still wasn't a good explanation for what were the causes for MS and neuroinflammation. But as I looked at my disease, it looked much more degenerative because there were no relapses. So I started reading about Parkinson's, ALS, cognitive decline, and Alzheimer's. And in all of those diseases, like toxins were a big factor, and mitochondria were a big factor. So I'm working on, okay, what can I do for my mitochondria? So looking for drugs, nothing there. I start looking for supplements, and I add supplements to support the mitochondria. Now, in the background that I'm not aware of is this emerging interest in the leaky gut, and Alessio Pisano, who writes his landmark papers that the leaky gut is the first step in autoimmunity, because when you have a leaky gut, these large, incompletely digested food proteins get into the bloodstream and develop immune responses. You also get lipopolysaccharides or bacterial fragments into the bloodstream, which amplify the immune response. So you call that as step number one, and that for many people, gluten sensitivity can be a factor leading to neurologic, psychiatric symptoms and enhancing lesions in your brain and spinal cord. Now we also now know that having certain bacterial or viral infections will increase the risk of autoimmunity later in life. And I believe there are about 16 different infecting organisms. And by the way, the coronavirus is one of them. And so not everyone who gets those infections will develop autoimmunity, but some will. And toxins, lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium also appear to increase the risk. Smoking increases the risk. Air pollution will increase the risk. And you can think about the global problem with wildfires and how that leads to poor air quality. Adverse childhood experiences increase the vulnerability. Severe prolonged stress as an adult increases the vulnerability. So, the research is sort of accumulating in the background, all of this stuff. Clinicians are still not talking about any of these multidisciplinary factors. Although, now, more recently, I've been attending the MS research meetings, and I see the MS basic scientists talking about the microbiome, about those co-infections, molecular mimicry. They're talking about leaky gut. They're talking about environmental factors, vitamin D, smoking, air pollution. And they're talking about this long prodrome of other symptoms that occur 5 to 10 years ahead of time that look like pelvic pain, endometriosis, severe heavy periods, migraines, infertility, and that these may occur 5 to 10 years before the onset of autoantibodies and before the onset of inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, or other systemic autoimmune disease. But most neurologists aren't aware of all of that. They may be aware of part of that, but they may not be aware of that whole, because it's, as a practicing physician, you're working really hard you're tired, you get home, you want to see your kids, baseball games or swim meets. And so it's hard to keep up with the latest findings in your specialty once you finish training.
So as a result of that, they kind of just gravitate towards whatever the accepted standard of care is without doing a whole lot of digging into the latest research.
In the latest disease-modifying drug treatments they'll be exposed to, so they'll stay current on that, but it's harder to stay current on what are the environmental factors. And even if they are willing to say, you know what, diet matters, you ought to do better on your diet, that it will get about that much attention in the office. But even if they would do that, that would be a marvelous first step to tell the patients, you know what, take the DMTs, but you really ought to cut out the sugar sweetened beverages and eat more vegetables.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, that would be a welcome first step.
Right. So talk to me a bit about the role of mitochondria in this, because mitochondria, first of all, is something that I talk a lot about. And given this is the energy blueprint, mitochondria certainly play a big role. And, previously, I think, when you and I were in high school and college biology classes, it was sort of thought mitochondria are just these sort of mindless energy generators. Yeah, they take in, carbs and fats and pump out ATP, and they don't really have much of a role beyond that. And now we know that they have profound roles in regulating the metabolism and regulating how cells and the immune system respond to things. Can you talk about what your conception is of mitochondria and their role is in autoimmunity and MS?
Well, we'll talk first about MS, the mitochondria. So in MS, there's two elements, the inflammation and the degeneration, or the shrinking of the brain and spinal cord. The inflammation represents the acute symptoms, the relapse, which gradually resolve. That's called the remission. The drugs do a great job of stopping those relapses. The drugs appear to do nothing for the neurodegeneration side. We have more evidence that the neurodegeneration side is a mitochondrial problem, that there's not enough energy in the brain to maintain a healthy myelin and to maintain those healthy axons. So, those parts of the brain diseases that have shrinking brains, cognitive decline, Parkinson's, ALS, and MS, that has been linked more closely to mitochondria. Are the mitochondria generating enough energy or not? And so there's two things that I think about when I talk to my patient about the mitochondria. One is you got to stop poisoning them, and you have to feed them more effectively. So stop poisoning them. So we can think about antibiotics, because our mitochondria are really ancient bacteria. So those antibiotics that kill off the bacteria are often stressful for our mitochondria. Many of the pesticides, herbicides that we use to make the food supply cheap are toxic to our mitochondria. Many of the industrial solvents are also poisonous to the mitochondria. Many of the heavy metals, lead, mercury, arsenic, are hard on your mitochondria. Gadolinium, a contrast agent that is important for brain imaging, is stressful for the mitochondria as well. So we have to address those things that are poisoning the mitochondria. And then the nutrients for the mitochondria. For most of Americans, we're getting 60 to 70, sometimes 80% of our calories from added sugars and processed foods. Mm-hmm. Well, if you have all of that junk in your diet, that doesn't leave enough calories for you to get the vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, essential fats, proteins that you're going to need to run the chemistry of life, to build the proteins that we need for the structures in life, the enzymes that we need, and to have the substrates that our mitochondria need. Mm-hmm. So, and I talk with my patients about, you got to stop the poisoning. You have to feed them real food. And I have strategies for the meat eaters for the omnivores, for the plant-based vegan vegetarians, for the ketogenic eaters, because we have to be thoughtful to be sure that we have everything that our cells need.
Mm-hmm.
If you get too much into, I'm going to eat this way for spiritual beliefs, and I'm not asking people to abandon their spiritual beliefs, but I still want you to know how to feed yourself for optimal health.
Yes, absolutely. So let's talk about some of your research. You've done actual formal studies looking at some of your dietary protocols, lifestyle protocols in the context of patients with MS. Tell us about some of that research and what results have you found?
So the way research happens, the usual sequence is you do a case report, a case series, then a single arm study, then small pilot controlled studies, then larger studies, and then larger, longer studies. So I was the first case report, then we had a small case series, then we had a single arm study where we replicated my interventions, the diet, supplements, meditation, exercise, e-stim. Very complicated. We're asking people to do a lot. They actually did a lot. That we radically changed their diet. We had a dramatic reduction in fatigue, a dramatic improvement in quality of life, and half of our folks with progressive MS had improvements in their walking ability. That is stunning success.
Mm-hmm.
Next thing that we did was, a couple small randomized controlled trials. Now we studied just the diet. So it's a simplified study. We again showed that people could implement the diet, in that compared to the control, the intervention group had less fatigue, higher quality of life, and better walking function. Then more recently, we did a larger study funded by the MS Society, where we had consented 85 folks, 77 made it through the intervention, 72 made it through 6 months. And we had a observation period where people came in, they had their assessments. We asked them to keep eating their usual diet. They came back in 12 weeks, we repeated all their assessments. We randomized them and trained them on either a low-fat Swank diet or the modified Paleo diet. They came back in 12 weeks, repeated all the assessments, came back, and then we didn't provide as much support for the next 12 weeks. And we let them reintroduce the nightshades in the Wahls group. Yeah, and then we brought them back at 24 weeks. So the first thing to say is, in the observation period, fatigue was stable, quality of life was stable, walking endurance was stable. Then in our main hypothesis was the Wahls group would have a greater reduction in fatigue severity as measured by fatigue severity scale score than the Swank group. And we also looked at the modified fatigue impact scale, quality of life scales, and a 6-minute walk test. Mm-hmm. To our surprise, both Swank and Wahls improved, and they were not statistically different between Wahls and Swank at 12 weeks or at 24 weeks for the fatigue severity scale score. However, in the other measures, in the quality of life measure, the mental health quality of life, physical health quality of life, the Wahls group was significantly better than the Swank group at both 12 weeks and 24 weeks. And the Wahls group had a greater fatigue reduction than the Swank group at 24 weeks with the modified fatigue impact scale. We'd ask people to not change their exercise program during this time period, because this is a diet study. And we also put on a actigraph to measure their basically how active they were. And what we saw was that at 12 weeks, no one had really changed. However, at 24 weeks, the Wahls group had clinically more physical activity than at baseline, although statistically, the difference between Wahls and Swank was 0.08, so not quite clinically significant. Mm-hmm. I think that the bottom line is, if we improve your diet, either with the Swank or the Wahls, we're going to have some improvement with fatigue reduction. And the Wahls is better than Swank for some measures. It'll be more telling if we can do a 2-year study to answer what is the long-term efficacy.
Yeah. Now, the other diet that you mentioned, the Swank diet, I believe is kind of extreme low-fat diet.
Yeah, so they limit it to 15 grams of saturated fat. And that's basically chicken breast, duck breast, no skin, white fish, no eggs, non-fat dairy only. We improve their diet by asking them to have 4 servings of whole grains in 4 servings of vegetables a day. Well, on our diet, it's 6 to 12 ounces of meat. We wanted 6 ounces of liver once a week. We wanted 6 to 9 cups of vegetables a day. If you're a man, it's 9 cups, or a tall lady, I'm 6 foot tall. If you're a petite person, 4'10", 4'11", then maybe that's only 6 servings of vegetables a day.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Now, why do you think, I mean, given that diet is quite different from the
Yes.
Wahls Protocol, especially you're advocating more of a higher fat diet and something approximating keto, and maybe you're not strict keto, but it's in that direction, right? And forgive me please correct me if I'm misrepresenting in any way.
What's interesting in terms of the saturated fat, the intake for the Swank group was well under 15. The Wahls group was at 16 grams of saturated fat. So we're a low saturated fat diet. It was higher in fat overall because it was higher in more omega-3, omega-6 fats as well. And at baseline, people had like 1.5 servings of vegetables. They had the standard American diet, very high in processed foods, added sugars, sugar-sweetened beverages. So replacing that with whole grains or vegetables is definitely a step in the right direction. Now, I think it would have been very interesting, instead of following people for 6 months, to follow them for 2 years to see does the difference between Wahls and Swank continue to grow over time. But I do want to tell your audience that when I'm working with patients, if they want to follow a low-fat diet, then what I stress is we still have to have the essential fats, omega-3s, omega-6 fats, and that we need plenty of vegetables. And we're going to watch your lipids overall, because I want your cholesterol to continue to be at least preferably 170 or 200. So I know that you have enough cholesterol for your brain and to make myelin. If people are changing their diets, doing it as a family, so that the whole family's on board with what it is that we've agreed that we're going to reduce or eliminate from the diet, what is it that we've agreed that we're going to increase and encourage in the diet, so that we can make those changes as a family, will greatly improve our success.
Gotcha. So as far as explanatory factors to account for both of the diets providing some benefits, although the Wahls Protocol being superior, we could say, would you say that the 2 biggest factors are probably, number 1, the removal of most processed foods and refined sugars and processed fats, and then number 2 being more vegetable consumption?
I think those are really, really important factors. And also I'll list out everything that I think is key. Taking out the inflammatory foods. We don't know who has unrecognized food sensitivities. Some of those folks will have. We don't know what number that would be, but certainly some would have that. And for them, that would be really important. Getting rid of the sugar in the processed foods, also really important. Getting more resistant starch, fiber, vegetables in, polyphenols to feed your microbiome, also really important. Getting enough protein in, really important. So I hate to be a reductionist. I much prefer to think it's the whole package. And I remind your viewers that I had done the AIP diet meticulously, carefully, for 5 years, and it wasn't enough. And that was when I was focused on what to remove I didn't have grain, legumes, dairy, yeah, but I wasn't focused on what to eat. And so I think it's the whole picture that made the big difference.
Got it. Have you had a sort of different reaction now that we're many years later and you've gotten the word out, you've done actual formal research validating that your methods have benefits? How do you feel, if at all, the reaction within the conventional medical community has changed towards you and your methods?
So over time, here at the university, I went from sort of eccentric oddity to brilliant visionary, and I've given grand rounds to a number of departments. We've presented our research, every year at the research update for the college, for the Department of Internal Medicine. That's been fun. And then in the MS world, I've joined the National MS Society's Nutrition Subcommittee on Wellness. And so that's been fun to be part of that committee. This is where other MS researchers that are conducting the dietary research, we meet once a month and talk about all of that. And then, it's refreshing to see that the neurologists are talking about diet matters, the microbiome matters, there is a leaky gut. And yes, many neurologists are saying there's more research behind the Mediterranean diet, and they'll recommend that to their patients. And that's fine. At least they are talking about a diet. And I'm hearing from more of our followers and my patients who are saying, my neurologist gave me a copy of your book when I was diagnosed. So we're making progress, and I find that exciting. And for all of the really challenging things that is happening in the internet space with YouTube and our social media platforms, with disinformation, it was those platforms that allowed my message to emerge back in 2011. So there's information and disinformation, and people right now have to struggle between sorting out which is which.
So my last question to you, and probably the one that is going to be where most of the gold from this podcast lies, which is people who either have autoimmune disease or who are looking to prevent autoimmune disease. What would you say are the top 3 or top 5 practical recommendations that they can do to achieve that?
Well, of course, buy my book. That'll be really helpful. So look carefully at your diet and self-care routine. What can you improve as a family? So ideally, you're going to take out the most inflammatory foods, which are sugar, gluten, and dairy. So I'd go after those 3 and replace them with non-starchy vegetables and berries. That would be a great start. Another thing that you could do that would be very helpful is to begin a meditative or a mindful practice. Or you could do Epsom salt soaks once a day. And then the third thing I'd encourage you to do is to know your vitamin D level and either go outside, get a tan, because your skin will make the vitamin D if you tan, or take supplements to get your vitamin D level in the top half of the reference range.
Beautiful. Very succinct. Dr. Wahls, thank you so much for your time. This was brilliant stuff. Thank you for the work that you've done and the research that you put out into the world. Do you have any final thought that you want to leave people with?
So we invite you to go to my website, terrywahls.com/diet, to get a 1-page handout of the diet that we use in our clinical trials. It'd be a really great resource for you and your family.
Wonderful. Thank you. On a personal note, I want to mention, you probably don't remember this, but a couple of years ago at the Mindshare gathering, of
Yes.
our peers and colleagues. You and I were both one of the 5 nominees. I think this was maybe 2019, the 5 nominees for top health influencer.
Oh, yeah.
And you won and you beat me. But the good news is the next year I won. So,
congratulations.
So we're both, fun fact is you and I both are one of the, I guess, handful, maybe dozen or so people who have won that award. So thank you for beating me, but but thank you again for this wonderful interview, and thank you for the work that you're doing. I really appreciate it. And it was a pleasure to finally connect with you.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. Hey there, this is Ari again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it valuable, please share it with your friends, share it with your family, help me get the word out there. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell to get notifications every time we release a new video or new episode of the podcast. And if you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for supporting my work at the Energy Blueprint. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you in the next one.